Hey friends, I'm sitting a little bit further away. I do have my new lavalier microphone. If you have feedback on audio quality, let me know in the comments. But March is Women's History Month, so let's talk about some great books by women who uplift women. I personally read books by women all year. I would say the vast majority of my reading is books by women and about women because I think women are awesome. But we can put a little bit of an extra emphasis on that in March. And I hope that some of these recommendations will catch your eye. If you haven't noticed, I'm officially on a posting schedule where I'm posting new content at noon on Sundays and Wednesdays. So if you want to check back during those times of the week, I will have new recommendations or reviews for you then. And if there are ever any lists or topics that you want me to cover, let me know. If there's something you want, I will feed the people. Okay, Women's History Month recommendations. This first one has recently become more controversial, but I really enjoyed By Any Other Name by Jodi Picoult. Now, the controversy is essentially that Jodi Picoult made a TikTok video, which I have not seen in full. I've only seen stitched because she's now deactivated her TikTok. But essentially, this book is about a woman who was writing many of the works that were published under Shakespeare's name, and essentially that Mitch Marlowe was kind of helping him source works written largely by women and claiming them, but that this was a way for some women to have independence from expectations during that time. This book also has some pretty dark themes, but I really enjoyed it and found it to be pretty captivating. So Jodi Picoult made a video basically asserting that there's no proof that Shakespeare existed. And I don't know exactly to what extent she fully believes that he didn't exist, or that she fully believes that the history is a little questionable, and that it is totally possible that in the time of Shakespeare, where men were literally cross-dressing on stage to play female characters because women couldn't act, that he wouldn't be above borrowing ideas or work from women. I'm not going to put words into Jodi's mouth. I think at a minimum, it's an interesting question to ask, right? Did Shakespeare write everything that he was credited for? I think, realistically, there are probably many, many works that are published under a male name that were written by a woman. I just think the likelihood of women not writing or creating for hundreds of years, slim to none. So I really enjoyed By Any Other Name. At a minimum, it's something that is ripe for discussion. If you don't want to read it because you have weird feelings about all of the Shakespeare questioning, that's for you to decide, but I liked it. Another Shakespeare-esque writing that I have not read yet but hope to read at some point is Hamnet. And this is from the perspective, I believe, of Shakespeare's wife. I haven't read it. I'm going to put a summary on the screen. But I do think that this idea of men taking credit for women's labor and intelligence and intellectual property is a really interesting theme to explore during Women's History Month. Kind of on that same kind of academia theme, you might really enjoy A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. This follows a woman who is at a school that is predominantly filled with men, and she is frequently questioned in her ability to pursue her field of study. And she goes to this very mysterious house to study this author and unravels a lot of mystery. I will say, this is my friend Kelsey's one of her favorite books, so I don't want to dig on it. I did not love the romance, and I made a fatal error in convincing myself that the fairy guy that's kind of described was David Bowie of The Labyrinth. And I just kept thinking about the bulge. It was so vivid in my mind because I just watched The Labyrinth for the first time right before I read it. And I just got a little single-minded on that one. But I do think it was good. And the sequel, A Theory in Drowning, comes out in 2025. So kind of a double thing to look forward to there. I do think that Ava Reid does a really phenomenal job of exploring themes of misogyny and women's empowerment. And so I do think that they are a great person to read during this month. Another book on my TBR, which I'm like ashamed I have not read yet. I just like haven't been in the mood for like a thoroughly thoughtful fantasy read, and that is Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang, who also wrote Sword of Kaigen, which is also like loaded up in my audiobooks. I just like haven't been ready for it. I think I'm going to be ready for it soon. But my understanding is that Blood Over Brighthaven is a dark academia story with lots of themes around patriarchy and misogyny and overcoming obstacles in those areas. So I've only seen incredible reviews for both books. If you've already read them, please provide me some motivation to go ahead and pick them up. And as soon as I feel like I have the brain power, I will absolutely be jumping into M.L. Wang's work. I do want to jump into a few books that are dystopian, where women do have a decent amount of power. And so I have to start with The Power by Naomi Alderman. This is set in a world where women suddenly discover that they have the ability to cause men pain and even kill them with their hands. I have joked many a time that this might be an aspirational story rather than a dystopian one, but it is dystopian. And I will say, if you watch the TV show, I've heard pretty bad reviews of that, but I really enjoyed this. So I think even if you didn't like the TV show, maybe give it a try. I do think the ending was like, not to my taste, but I did overall really appreciate the story. And there's just like incredible little nuggets throughout, right? Like one of the first thing that happens when society realizes that women have this ability is suddenly they're like, men, don't go out alone, stay in packs, protect yourselves. And it's like immediately the society takes more care to protect men than they ever did to protect women from men, which, you know, is jarring and sad, but also very interesting. And if you are looking for a dystopian book to read this month, Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler is an absolute must. It explores themes of class and gender, of like a dystopian society ruled by an oligarch. It's also set in 2025. Will also probably depress you a little bit, but I do really think it's a must read. And I think my book club is going to be reading it soon. So if you're interested in reading it with us, once we finish the Hunger Games series, let me know. One other book I have not yet read is Madame Restelle. This is the story of an abortionist, and I believe that it is historical fiction. I have an art copy that I got from a bookstore that was closing, and I am going to read it. Have I read it yet? No. I have a hard time picking up historical fiction. Usually once I've picked it up and started it, as long as it's not Regency, I do like them. But it's never like a thing calling to me. But I do think that this could be a great Women's History Month read. I would be absolutely remiss if I was not thoughtful and purposeful in including the voices of trans women in our Women's History Month reading. I am getting ready for the Trans Rights Readathon, and I will be reading Nevada, which I am excited to read. I'll put a summary over here. I had checked this out from the library to read during the readathon last year and did not get to it, but it is on its way back to me through the hold system. Another that I'm hoping to read this year during the readathon is Detransition Baby. And what I have heard of this book so far is that there are 3 characters who are all at like different intersections in understanding like womanhood, and that one of these people has detransitioned. I believe that one of them is pregnant, and then it talks a lot about like what womanhood is and what it means. And I think that that would be a phenomenal read for this month. And beyond reading women's fiction, we can be reading women's memoirs to understand the story of their lives. I recently read Men Have Called Her Crazy, and it's from the perspective of a woman who has a lot of trauma. That bird is really close. And she's endured a lot of trauma at the hands of men, and thus is really distrustful of them, and frankly, I think rightly so. Hey, birdie. If you know anything about birds, you can tell me what kind of bird it is, but it's this teeny tiny little bird. He's so loud. He's like teeny tiny and white and gray, and he has a black head, and he's so cute. And now that I'm talking about him, he's going away. Anyway, Men Have Called Her Crazy is a really interesting look at some of the flaws in mental health care, but also some of the benefits. One of the things that really resonated with me and impacted me in listening to this memoir is that at the end, the author talks about returning to DBT tools and practices, and that is something that I have in my toolbox from having gone to therapy that I often forget about. And so it kind of reminded me to like pull some of those tools back into my life. And it was really, really helpful to me. If you have not yet read Educated, I think it is a must-read memoir. It is about a woman who grows up in a very dysfunctional family led by extremely like paranoid religious folks. I don't think that they're IBLP necessarily. I'm not saying what I think they are, but really, really difficult family life, and she decides to leave and get an education. And I do think it can come across a little bit of a like pull yourself up by the bootstrap story, but I really think it's just the story of an exceptionally intelligent woman who left a really dangerous home, but is still so human that that kind of culture kind of keeps pulling her back in, and we see that like pull to her family. I really enjoyed Educated. I binged it, and I would definitely recommend listening to the audiobook if you're able to. And speaking of audiobooks, if you have not listened to Drew Afualo's memoir, I guess it's a memoir, Loud, this is like the most empowering book I have ever read. Drew does not make herself small for men, and she talks about how she became that way and how her family helped her to become that way and what she has learned along the way. And this came to me at a time where I was in a really complicated friendship with someone who I think wanted me to be smaller than I was. And it was so empowering. It was phenomenal. Drew is funny and smart. And I'll be honest, listening to her memoir showed me how like strategic and thoughtful she is besides being funny on TikTok. So if you haven't yet listened to Loud, this is the perfect time to do it. 2 more memoirs from women. One that I have not yet read yet, and that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. She was the victim of Brock Turner, and her sexual assault was put basically like on the front page for the world to see. I have a physical copy of this book in my home. I cannot find it. I know it is in my home. But on top of that, I am in the wait list for the audiobook on Libby. And I do think that it is very important that we like witness these experiences of other women and listen to women and believe them and give them time and space to talk about like how they have been treated by men in society in this way. So I will definitely be reading that as soon as my Libby hold comes up. And the last memoir I want to recommend is The Manicurist's Daughter. I was sent a copy of this by Celadon Books last year. And this is ultimately the story of a woman whose mother was pulled in by a very manipulative doctor who was targeting women of like very specific ethnicities and targeting their like cultural insecurities to convince them to have very dangerous plastic surgeries. And it is devastating, but it talks a lot about the ways that women are expected to show up in society and what happens if we challenge that. And I thoroughly enjoyed listening to what she has to say about the world. And as always, I do try to include a few nonfiction recommendations, and the 2 that I think I have to recommend for Women's History Month are Invisible Women, which is about like how data shows us that patriarchy is alive and well, and Men Who Hate Women, which is about like incels and incel culture and how men become that way. And both of these books have the potential to be scarier than any of the horror that you're reading outside of this list, but I do think they're important to read. And those are my recommendations for Women's History Month. So if you have other recommendations, leave them in the comments. If you have requests for future videos, let me know. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe so you can see what I put out next.